Good afternoon and welcome back to the next session of the Caribbean Urban Forum. This session is a virtual only session, so it will be slightly different to some of the sessions we've run already. We're expecting a very exciting session. We have two stimulating presentations, and it's around the general theme of climate change, adaptation and mitigation. And I'd like to introduce the two speakers to you briefly, and then I will ask the first speaker to make his presentation. We will take questions after each presentation, only one or two. It'll be done virtually, so if you can put your questions in the Q&A in the chat, and we will monitor that, and we will put the questions to the presenters. So thank you again for coming back and attending this session. And I'll move on now to tell you who your two presenters are. They're Joseph Williams, and he's from the Caribbean Development Bank, and Grace Lefourie, who is from Trinidad and Tobago. And I'll give you their full biographies in a minute. But first, the first speaker will be Joseph Williams. Screen. Joseph Williams is a coordinator sustainable energy at the Caribbean Development Bank. He joined the bank in 2014, and among other things, he has led the development and implementation of the bank's current energy sector policy and strategy. He has 30 years of experience in the energy sector in the Caribbean, covering policy, project implementation, and financing. In the past, he's practiced as an electric utility engineer, regional energy management consultant, and has also managed the CARICOM energy program, so he has very wide experience. Mr. Williams is a professional mechanical engineer and holds a Master of Science degree in energy management with an emphasis on energy policy and planning, a Master's of Business Administration in Finance and Sustainability. So he has a fairly wide-ranging background, and obviously very related to this issue on the agenda. And his presentation is about renewable energy investments, maximizing the contribution to urban development in the Caribbean. So can I ask Joseph to join us now and make his presentation?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. I hope you have been having a good conference so far, and I'm happy to make a contribution on behalf of the Caribbean Development Bank. I will just go right ahead to share my screen to put the presentation. Can you see my screen?
I can.
Okay.
Yes, your screen is up.
Okay, thank you so much. So the focus of the presentation is on renewable energy as a part of the conversation around its contribution to the climate change challenge. And in this context, urban development contribution, maximizing contribution to the urban development in the Caribbean. Thank you. So I hope to touch on a few areas I have outlined here. We will just quickly look at how the energy fits into the whole sustainable development and linked to the climate issue, no doubt. And then the matter of net zero drive and implication for urban development, Caribbean energy situation and the role of the renewable energy, I've abbreviated RE, and then RE investments and urban development, and then what CDB is doing in terms of enhancing support for the transition. So here we go. So as we know, the energy is an important input or aspect or dimension of achieving virtually all the SDGs. Yeah, we kind of take energy for granted until, you know, the power is out. Then we really realize how much we have taken it for granted. But it's really a very essential input for economic development broadly, but critical, obviously, for sustainable development. So if we think about the whole question of poverty, hunger, quality education, you really need affordable and reliable energy. Similarly, for the others, including SDG number 11, which relates to sustainable cities and communities. And that's broad because that in and of itself covers a range of other focus areas, thematic areas. And so it is critical there as an area, but also the related areas. And then, of course, the other SDGs. So we like to think of it as being critical, even directly or indirectly. The International Energy Agency, as well as the International Renewable Energy Agency, have developed pathways to achieving the net zero 2050 targets. So for the IEA, they contemplate that in 2050, buildings, 85% of buildings will need to be zero carbon in order for the goals to be achieved. And similarly, they are projected that 70% of electricity will come from photovoltaics and wind power. In their articulation of the options, what has come up as a common feature in all the options, all the pathways, is that electrification is the way of the future. So most things, to the extent feasible, will be electrified. And that even includes some of the heavy industries or end-use activities. And in that context, it brings into question, obviously, the source of the generation or the power for the electrification. Electricity is a carrier, energy carrier, as you know, so you need generation sources for that to operate. And so renewable energy is the big focus because that is what is going to displace the current fossil fuel generation that we have broadly across the globe. In that context, the transport sector becomes important because, as is the case globally, but also in the Caribbean, the transport sector is a significant part of the energy consumption profile of countries. In fact, in most Caribbean countries, more than 50% of the energy imported in the form of fossil fuel, petroleum and petroleum products goes to transport sector. And so the whole question of electrifying the transport sector is a big part of the strategy towards 2050. And there are significant declarations, targets, even amongst the major vehicle manufacturers. Digitalization is going to be an important part of that in terms of controlling, integrating, and interoperating of systems in a manner that brings greater efficiency and coordination and optimization of space as well as the different assets. And so the whole question of smart cities really going to be driven a lot by greater electrification and the integration of the various systems, with renewable energy being a big part of the driver and the transport system being largely electrified. And so the whole question of smart grid and how we interface with that Internet of Things going to be a big part of the conversation. And so they have articulated a number of fora, including the World Economic Forum, have noted that cities are key to net zero future, where there will be affordable, sustainable access. And right now we know, you are experts, most people in this forum are stakeholders, so you know that cities are a global economic engine, responsible for 80% of global GDP. Cities account for 70% of CO2 emissions. And the whole question of investing in low carbon and resilient urban development will be key in that context. Basically, I'm reinforcing what I said before there. And the whole role of digitalization is mentioned there, giving an idea of the kind of contribution that this digitalization can bring to reduction in the context of buildings emission. So there are a number of dimensions to cities, of course, but obviously the let me say urban space for that matter. But obviously buildings are a key part of that, the built environment. And the issue there is how do you reduce the emissions in that context? I must say in passing that the issue is far more than energy efficiency in terms of how you operate building systems. It's now also about embodied carbon. So you're talking about what's the level of carbon input in the materials and systems that go into construction of the different physical built environment. That's where the conversation is in terms of establishing sustainable cities. And there are a number of initiatives globally that are seeking to put that in a framework that can allow for tracking and accounting for same. I mentioned urban transport, I won't deliberate on that, but an interesting statistic here is that in the Caribbean, 27% of the population, approximately 5 million, live in capital cities. I'm not saying town and urban centers, no. I'm just talking about capital cities, Bridgetown, Port of Spain, and so on. So that's an interesting figure because we can see that's a significant proportion of the population. There are a number of initiatives globally that are looking at this issue of the efficiency and how to optimize the buildings, really. There's a World Global Building Council. There is, with an initiative called Carbon Buildings Commitment, looking at footprint, efficiency, renewable energy, embodied carbon, carbon offsetting, and so on. And a number of others I've indicated there, which are articulated in the JLL, but also by the World Economic Forum. Quite interesting because it's about how to create accounting frameworks to track and to measure progress in terms of achieving the targets, well, establishing targets and reaching those targets. The last point I want to make in terms of the high-level picture of the urban development as it interfaces with cities and energy is that the approach of system efficiency is a model that is also being promoted globally. And the idea here is that cities should focus on increasing renewable energy and electrification and final energy use, using digitalization to integrate system. For example, optimizing demand for greater flexibility, accelerating the transition to e-mobility, and decarbonizing heating and cooling, right? And this also includes reducing land use space, transport consumption through smart growth and practices. And it's all about compactness. It's all about integrating so that different elements can talk to each other in a digital way towards more optimal operation. And so they have identified efficiency and distributed resources in this framework as being very important. So building efficiency, we know to reduce carbon emissions, we need to improve the efficiency in buildings. And we understand that quite well. Changing your lights to more efficient light, LED, and so on and so forth. But as I mentioned before, it's going to go much further than that. It's about the material themselves and what is embodied in terms of the carbon input to get those material, those physical structures in place. That is also going to be a part of this efficiency conversation. Distributive energy resource is also a very important one, because what we're saying is that renewable energy allows for a very modular approach to the supply of energy. And in that frame, it allows for what we call greater democratization, inclusiveness of the population, citizens, different group in the production of energy and production, supply, and distribution of energy. And that is going to be important because that modularity will allow for significant flexibility in cities of the future. So that, and I'll probably mention this a little later. So the whole question of urban challenges and how you treat with some of the peri-urban issues and challenges, energy solution can bring empowerment to MSMEs, to affordability challenges, reducing losses in the system, and so on. So there's a whole range of scope for innovation around distributed energy that is provided by renewable energy that hitherto was not possible in the conventional, traditional, centralized system. So I want to couple energy efficiency with DER as an important dimension of the integrated way forward that is going to change the shape and profile of what urban centers, cities look like by the time we get to 2050. I mentioned electrification of transport, but that is huge because electrification is more than displacing the current fossil fuel usage. It is also about changing the way we produce and store energy. So for example, to the extent that the grid allows for, you have greater supply from renewable energy, vehicles can now become a part of storage, and then they can also help with supply in peak period and so on, which can also be controlled by the utility based on the architecture of greater digitalization. Well, architecture utilizing, sorry, greater digitalization. So it's no longer just your system control, but it's also about what happens at the consumer end, and the utilities having the power to control that. So the utilities would, in a certain frame, within a certain tariff arrangement, would be allowed to connect you and disconnect you if you are, say, storing power and to integrate that power into the grid. Because then they can, all the vehicles or mobile units around can then be sources that the utility manages to meet their demand at different times of the day. So that's the future, and it's linked to the shift, but also digitalization, an important part of that. I mentioned decarbonization and so on, but I'll just stop there because I think I touched on these broadly. What's the situation in the region? So that's the high level picture in terms of where we're going, the role of renewable energy broadly in terms of ensuring that we can achieve the kind of urban space and cities in the future. But in the Caribbean, where are we? The fact is that the climate change remains the dominant driver for us in terms of the need to, as a part of the global community, make the shift to renewable energy away from fossil fuel. That is very clear. Our mandates are clear, the strategies are clear, the country's commitments are clear in the context of Paris Agreement. And the link between that and also climate resilience, and also, well, climate resilience broadly, but resilience generally of the system, is very clear. So as a dominant theme, that's very important. But we also articulate, and certainly from CDB side, we've been very keen to make the point that the energy security objective remains a very important one, and possibly the overarching objective for many countries still, because the question of supply risks, availability, in terms of the ships arriving to deliver the oil, right? If you have significant dislocation, it means that countries with limited storage could simply be cut off from supply. So that's a very important risk. We're talking about the overdependence on import as a number of associated challenges, high cost of electricity due to the isolated markets, small markets, and diesel generation as a technology, which feed into unaffordability, and then the whole price instability having to do with volatility in the market. So all of those things could be encapsulated in the context of energy insecurity. And so we are saying, given what we even know now today, all of us are faced with increased prices at the pump or in our utility bills. We are saying that this remains an overarching issue for most Caribbean countries to shift so that they can hedge against some of these risks and issues. And so there is climate change, which we are pursuing, and through which we're going to get a lot of support, and all the issues and challenges fall under that umbrella. Well, a number of them. But we believe as a region, this energy insecurity is still a dominant reason as to why we need to shift and shift urgently. Where are we now? Essentially, about 12% of the capacity in the region is coming from renewable energy. That is the electrical capacity. The target for 2027 is really 47%. There's a small error there, which if extrapolated to 2030, it should be 55%. So I'll correct that. It's really 55% in 2030. But the official target set by the countries is regionally is 47% by 2027, which means that we have to find at the end of 2021, it meant that we should have been at 32% if we were going to be on track, and we are now at 12%. So we have some ways to go. And if you look across the chart at the bottom, you can see where the countries are relative to their targets that have been set. And many countries have 100% target. So there's a big gap. The message here is that there's a big gap between where we are in terms of the installed capacity for renewable energy and where we need to get to. A lot of the challenges in terms of the transition has to do with the policy and regulatory framework. Again, this is a kind of a mapping showing where the countries are in terms of important policies, strategies. The dark blue are recent updates and in policies and some of the important regulations. There are important regulations that need to happen to incentivize private sector participation, but also to provide clarity and also to ensure that you have an orderly transition of the system. The fact is that it's illegal in many territories to generate your own power, and worse, even to connect to the grid. So you really need the legislative changes as well as the regulatory frames changes for those things to happen. And so the mapping here is really saying all those white spaces and all those light blue or light colored spaces, except for the bright yellow ones and maybe the bright blue ones, it really indicating the gaps that need to happen in a significant way. Just really a handful of countries that have the really appropriate policies to make things happen. So coming back to the insecurity issue. So we know that this is big, and we are saying we are not where we are supposed to be. And I'm advocating that the energy security issue is an important driver. And this is an example just to make the point of the importance of the energy insecurity issue and how that could feed into the issue of urban planning. So in 2019, the region spent about $8 billion on import of fossil fuel right across 19 BMCs of CDB. This is more than the 5 billion in food. So the energy bill, import bill was much greater than the food bill. And if you look at that 8 billion, it's more than the GDP of about eight BMCs, 8 borrowing member countries. So that's significant. But what we are saying is that since January 2022 to present, the countries have had to find 1.8 billion US dollars in additional cash to pay for oil. So think about that. Just since January of this year, because of the increases in the market, compared to 2019, the countries have had to find $1.8 billion. And so it gives you an idea of what that means for stresses on the foreign exchange, but also given that government is the largest user of energy, what it means for their bill and so on. And so if we are really going to move away, it means not replacing the fossil fuel base represents less climate resilience. It's a major risk to our poverty reduction efforts and achieving the SDGs, which are closely linked to this question of urban development. The fiscal risk for countries, it means that we continue to undermine that when we have the kinds of shocks that we are experiencing. And there's a risk of uncompetitiveness and missing out on the green trade. The fact is that the 2050 net zero represents, for those countries that have renewable energy, a grand opportunity to participate in the green trade, in the global green trade. So what it means here is that for our energy situation is that climate change and net zero 2050 remains a critical driver for the transition, right? So we know that. We mentioned that in terms of the climate change. And anchoring our transition in that frame brings a number of benefits. It's very important because a number of the resources that's going to help us to transform reside in that space. However, there's a very compelling business case rooted in the energy security objective for Caribbean countries to transition their energy sector. This case is most evident in the context of the current spike, and I use some examples to illustrate that just now. What does this mean for urban development and planning? Well, we know that the question of urban planning as a function lies mainly with the government as a function. What it means is that the observation generally, as is the case for many of the government entities, that they are largely underfunded because of the fiscal issues that governments face across the region. And it's not just planning, but it's also about the maintenance services, the regulation. It's about inadequacy of the capital budget to do all the things that need to be done in that space to give us the kind of modern facilities and that we need going forward. The public sector, as I mentioned before, is the largest user of energy in most countries, which means that they absorb a big part of government budget just paying for energy. To the extent that the public sector, just for example, could move quickly, apart from what the country does normally, it would mean that there's a significant amount of resources that could be released that could help even with just urban development and planning and helping to ensure that we have the kind of broader public goods available to support other things. And it also could allow for providing energy services in some of the peri-urban areas that are challenged with all the challenges that the experts in this forum know well. And we could talk about crime, property value, and so on. That if government had fiscal space, if the approach of making use of the technology could be adapted and innovated to address a number of these problems, we could be much further on. That's the important message here. And if you put numbers to that, it's amazing, because what it means is that out of a 1.8 billion across the region, that could translate to significant average of $63 million available on a BMC basis that could be added to this space. Green cities will have increased value in terms of the real estate, and what we're focused on here now is about renewable energy investments in adding value to this urban development conversation. So the whole question of green cities and smart cities is going to be a very current issue as we move forward, because what it means is that for tourist product and value and service generally, you will be able to secure higher returns for outputs. Smart and resilient cities are the way of the future. That has been made already, and the importance of DRE, distributed renewable energy, is going to be very important, and the flexible grid in making that happen. Cleaner cities going to be critical, and renewable energy and the flexibility we talk about is going to be important. And that feeds into a number of things, including morale of citizenry, in terms of green space, and a number of things that can come out of an integrated, efficient, optimized approach to planning and implementation. And I've already emphasized the e-mobility and the importance of that in terms of enhancing value and welfare, because what we're talking about here is making enterprises out of what was traditionally just consumption. CDB in this space. So what we have done so far in terms of our energy efficiency and renewable energy intervention is largely on the energy efficiency side. And most of our infrastructure projects that have been funded take into consideration, I said most, but I should have said all, because really that question is asked in the context of all the projects we fund from an infrastructure standpoint as to whether or not there are opportunities to integrate energy efficiency and renewable energy. And to the extent that they are, then we seek to support that. So in this case, we have done projects in 6 of the countries, well, approved projects for 6 of the countries in terms of retrofitting street lighting to more efficient lighting, which feed into the energy security issue I mentioned before, because it relieves government of cost of some of the budgetary constraints, because governments are largely responsible for paying the street lighting bill and so on. And also there are other environmental benefits that we well know about that kind of retrofit. Smart metering, we have done some of that, because that's also feed into engendering a smart environment for cities. And then we have also supported the Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code, which is now being adopted by the bank. Well, it has been adopted that the bank will be, I'm not saying that correctly. The bank has established that it will be utilizing this to guide its intervention in the energy efficiency space. Sorry about that, right? So that is something that's going to be important in helping us to move a little closer to the goal we're talking about. And we are also pursuing some interest in innovative programs. One of them is what we call our Integrated Utilities Service Program, which will allow us to be engaged in supporting projects behind the meter. So your residential, small businesses and so on could also participate in a rollout program there. There is a program being pursued by our Environmental Sustainable Energy Unit, and Environmental Sustainable Unit. They manage this program, but it's a CDB EU program, really falling under the 11th EDF. It's called the Caribbean Action for Resilience and Enhancement Program, CARE for short. And it will, in a sense, we think this is one of the things that some of the municipalities, even the city councils and so on, could make use of some of the resources there that are available to help with assessments, doing some of the studies around disaster risk management and vulnerability assessment in terms of understanding the way forward, natural hazards and so on, because it's linked heavily to resilience. This is now since this year that this has been fully operational. So this is one of the things that could be relevant to some of the participants in this conference to think about. And I just want to close on this last part to say what it will take for us to achieve the 2050 net zero, but even more closely in this case, 2030 targets. And the figures on the screen give you an indication of the kind of scope and scale that need to be achieved in order for us to achieve that. So, for example, the rate of implementation of RE capacity around the region needs to increase some 1,400% over the next year, over the current rate. And that gives you an idea of what the scale and the magnitude of the challenge. Notwithstanding, I think it's important to also note that the renewable energy resources that we have in the region far outstrip the capacity, the need, demand. So for example, and this is just an example, if you look at the wind as one of the key options, so I've highlighted here solar, wind, hydropower, geothermal. The bar graph at the bottom of the screen is really saying to us, that blue represents the total electricity demand, capacity, installed capacity throughout the 19 countries. And that is about, let me say, just about 6 gigawatts. So that's just 6 gigawatts. A study we did in 2020, looking at about 9 countries in the Caribbean, the technical potential for offshore wind, this is just one area, this is not total wind, this is just offshore wind, is about 60 gigawatts. So even when you do all the scaling back, you get to the market potential and look at all the things, we are saying just in one area, we have enough to support all the energy needs, whether we move all our transport sector to the grid from renewable energy. Geothermal in the Eastern Caribbean, I've used that as an example on that side. This one is now in megawatt. Over in the Eastern Caribbean, the total installed capacity is somewhere around 300 megawatts. And the geothermal potential is somewhere about 2,000 megawatts. So I use this just to illustrate that the resource is not the issue, it's just about how we make that transition in the shortest time and to make the framework for it to happen. And so CDB, in closing, and this is my last section here, and I'll close in a minute, is suggesting an accelerated approach that we want to encourage the countries, the partners, to get on board with a very asserted approach to how we move the transition forward. And this involves really pursuing some big initiatives in public sector, as well as broadly, that will involve private sector investment, along with what has already been done, but making use of the partnerships we have with both members of the bank, but also other MDBs and all the other partners who are involved and working in the region. So I give a flavor of some of the ideas we have there that will need to be significantly scaled up and for us to move with very, very, very aggressive pace over the next years to 2030. So I want to stop here. Thank you very much. I know I was a little fast, but I wanted to cover as much as possible. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much for that very stimulating discussion. And I think it certainly highlights a number of issues. If anybody in the watching us virtually has a question, please could they put it immediately, because at the moment I don't think we have anything specific. And if we don't, I'll ask a question and then we'll move on. Has anyone got a question? Right. In that case, have we got a right? Okay, we've got a couple of questions in the room. Is it possible to take those? Yes, if you can go to the mic.
Yes, thank you. Great presentation. I just saw the bullet point on the smart metering of the meters, the electrical meters, and what does that entail? I just wanted a little clarification on that point.
Okay, thanks. You don't mind telling me who you are and your organization, just so I can make sure I at least...
Yes, no problem. Okay, my name is Bradley Guy. I'm a forestry engineer from Dominica.
Okay, thank you so much, Bradley, and thanks for your question. So the traditional approach to the utility supplying you with the power, and the meter is considered the cash register for the utility, right? That's how they view it. So the traditional approach is that they would supply you with the energy, and the meter registers what you consume, and somebody periodically would come around and read your electricity meter, and then they send you a bill sometime later. Smart metering is really a platform, because there are a range of services that can be provided that allows the utility to carry out its business, to measure and bill you in terms of their main service that will be provided to the customer. So there's that side, and they have a number of functionalities. I just mentioned a few of them that are embedded now in the meter that they can hopefully, or the intention is to serve you better. So that's from the utility side. But the smart meter also allows the customer to also have access to some functionalities that can help them to manage their energy better, interact with the utility better, understand their patterns and use over time, and be able to make decisions in a timely way. So that's a high-level picture of the objective here. So it's now putting in, using digital technology to embed a lot more service in your meter to allow it to help the stakeholders, in this case, the customer and the utility, to interact in a better way. So what's the utility looking for? One, they want to understand your load profile. So your load profile can help them to understand how to plan generation better. So when you put your lights on, when you use your load, and how things move. And so it's pretty much a curve to say, you peak at this time of the day, and so on and so forth. So the meter now can track your usage on a more granular basis. So rather than giving you a consumption at one point in time, they can actually track your consumption by the second, but it's not practical. They probably collect it every 15 minutes. That's a traditional way. And they could put that in a graph, and then they can aggregate for everybody, and they can see what the profile and what's driving it. And then they can ask themselves, what are the equipment being used here at this time of the day? And so how they can then manage and better inform their policy and how better to serve. So that's one side. It allows them to have data. So if you want to go back and check something in a detail at a certain point in time in the past, that data is now being collected on a real-time basis and also being stored in a way. So they have more information about the customer, and they can better able to serve you. So that's one side. On the other side, the customer can better understand his or her own profile in terms of his usage pattern. You have smart meters that can allow you to even manage different elements within your entity. Now, I'm not sure all the utilities are utilizing those aspects of the platform. They are smart, so the utility no longer needs necessarily to come to read your meter. They can do this remotely. And I'm saying it's implemented at different degrees. So I'm not suggesting that all of these functions are implemented in all the countries and so on where they're being rolled out. But I'm just trying to tell you, that's what smart metering allows. It can also allow the utility to control some things within the customer. So the utility could actually disconnect a customer without actually visiting that site. That's the kind of functionality. So
thank you very much.
Just to give you a flavor. Thanks.
Thank you, Joseph. We've got another question for you, and one from the chat, and then we'll probably have to move on.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Leonard Francis from Jamaica, from the National Environment and Planning Agency. Just three quick things, man, very brief. Do you have any separate data on the energy possibilities for each country? Because you're showing aggregated data in terms of possibilities for generation and consumption. And what is the possibility of energy transfer from one country to another? So Barbados is producing excess. Are there countries we could actually sell it to using underground and other cables? And what is the possibility, the real possibility of using nuclear energy in the Caribbean? So that's three quick.
Okay, so the first one is easy. Yes, we have some data because we use that for our development of planning and understanding the countries, but we also work collaboratively with the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. So CDB has an agreement with CUF, and so a lot of the issues around data and so on, we'll be working closely with them because it's a better way to serve the rest of the Caribbean. And sometimes we can fund some initiative to help the countries better understand their own profiles and so on. So that's the approach here. But the answer to that is yes. The question of integration of system is a big one. So the latest study we have is, goes back to 2010, and it's really focused on the Eastern Caribbean. One of the things we're doing forward in this big macro approach I'm telling you about, sorry, this transformative approach, is to really look at that again. So right now, IDB, CDB, and SICRI have in mind to look at some of these. We have a study going on in the Eastern Caribbean around green hydrogen that's going to look again at the interconnection between some countries and so on. So yes, it's feasible in some cases. The depth is a limiting factor, but there are areas that can be done. So if we're going to do it big, that's one of the areas that we'll be pursuing. But it's a part of the transformative agenda. And the final one is that the nuclear is not considered viable or feasible for the region, not because of the technical issues, but because of other reasons. So there are political agreements around the region being nuclear zone free, and I won't get into that, but just to flag it. So that's a big issue there. Besides, nuclear in the context of the net zero is still not agreed because it is seen as having a number of challenges. Let me just leave it there. So no, it's not on the agenda for the Caribbean countries, or certainly CDB. It's not in our policy as an area that we'll look at. And there are other issues I'm mentioning that may limit even the countries themselves looking at that, even if somebody had a good idea.
Right. I've got another, before I take another question in the room, I've got one more question from the chat, which is from Doreen Duncan from Island City Lab. And she wants to know what you were doing about managing storage intermittency in the grid.
Oh, thank you so much. And that's a very, very important question. And is one that is, certainly as a bank, we are very clear that this has to be a part of a consideration for all the projects we do around variable renewable energy, that is solar, wind. So we will ask that question, and we will seek to integrate that as much as possible for two reasons. One, it's important as a means of optimizing the integration of these things in the grid. So it provides for greater stability and makes the system run better and so on. That's one reason. The other reason is that it's also an important part of the resilience conversation. So for those reasons, we promote it, but also the evidence so far around the region, there are a number of countries that have implemented batteries. The evidence has shown that it is a critical part in making sure that it doesn't deteriorate. It meaning the variable renewable energy integration are not adverse to the utility operation. So I think most people agree that is an important part. How it's rolled out is another discussion, and we can get into that. We can talk about the models and how it affects the regulatory framework, but that's a little bit more involved discussion I could get into if you want to pursue it a little later. Thanks.
Okay. I have one last question in the room, but I'm only going to be able to allow another 2 or 3 minutes because we do have another very important speaker, and it's a fascinating subject which I'm sure we could all talk about for a long time, but we do have to move on. So can I have the next question?
Thank you. Hi, Joseph Graham King from UWI.
Hey, Graham, good to see you. Good to see you. Long time, yes.
Hey. Question about grid interconnection throughout the Caribbean. Is that something you at the CDB are looking at? And how does that tie then into the sort of intermittent storage equation as well?
So the answer is yes. And I was mentioned to the earlier speaker, we actually are in the process of doing an updated study, and it's looking at how we're going to integrate offshore wind with geothermal to get the kind of impact. So the question around integration the answers to the question, integration, they're a big part of the debate around integration. And so the answer is yes. And it's a question of what, well, I'm trying to remember the last part of the question, but around storage is an important part of that. That will be considered in that mix, because once it's variable, then we have to think about storage.
Can I thank you very much again? And we may get a chance to have further questions, but I would like now to move on to our next speaker, who will be talking to us about the role of urban and regional planning in mitigation of climate change. And our speaker is Grace Lafourie, and she's worked as an urban and regional planner for over 40 years, mainly in Trinidad and Tobago, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and the Turks and Caicos. She received her undergrad training at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, and her postgraduate degree is from Loughborough University of Technology in England. She's also a holder of a certificate in recognition of satisfactory completion of a one-year program as a fellow in the Fulbright Fellowship Program. And I think she has obviously a significant academic career. She is currently the president of the Trinidad and Tobago Society of Planners, which organization she's represented today at this conference. And I think she has a lot to contribute to this broader discussion of resilience and adaptation. So if I could hand over now to Grace, she will present her finding.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Penfold, and thank you to the organizers of this year's Urban Forum for allowing us the opportunity to participate and make a contribution. This issue of transportation that Joseph spoke about is very much a part of the problem that we face with respect to climate change, given the kind of the extent of the emissions of carbon dioxide in particular from the transportation sector. Joseph talked from the point of view of alternatives to fossil fuels, which is critical. But as planners, we have to look at ourselves and to look at the ways in which we can mitigate the problem. So if we have the first slide, I'm having a little bit of an issue with my camera. So Mrs. Penfold has volunteered to manipulate the slides. So what do we expect from climate change? Just to go through it very quickly, I have just 15 minutes, I think. Air temperature increases, sea surface temperature increases. We have an increase in intensity of rainfall and flooding and floodplains. Rising sea levels that lead to coastal flooding and loss of coastal habitats. Of course, increased rates of coastal erosion, coastal storms, and storm surge that lead to degradation of wetland ecosystems and coral reefs, and further shoreline erosion and inundation, hurricanes and storms, bleaching of our coral reefs. So those are the issues that we need to be looking at from the lens of the planner to determine how we might have contributed to the problem and how we can contribute to its solution. Next slide. So what is causing it? The number of issues. There's issue of power generation, which touches a lot on what Joseph spoke of. Industrial activity, waste matter, agriculture, and of course, transportation is a big one for planners, given the link, the connection between land use and transportation. And we have found that our carbon dioxide emissions have doubled between 1990 and 2006 in an exact match with the increase in the number of motor vehicles on our roads by almost 100% over the same period. So that suggests that there's a clear link between what we do on our roads, how we travel, and the extent of our contribution to the greenhouse gas problem. So where are we going? Where's this transportation taking us? Mostly to work. The city of Port of Spain contains around 17% of the jobs in the country, but it's home to only 3% of the population. So it means that people are having to come into Port of Spain. And this is sorry, next slide, please. Next. Okay, so this is a good picture of what it looks like during the morning commute. This was taken around 8:30 one morning, weekday morning, and this is what it's like every weekday. You have 3 lanes of traffic coming in to Port of Spain and nothing going out. So where are those people coming from? Next slide. So everybody is coming to Port of Spain to work. We have people coming from what we call deep south and central Trinidad, and people coming from the east, everybody coming to Port of Spain. Next slide. And where do they live? In what we call dormitory settlements, contributing to urban sprawl. And we and the planners to blame, not always, because I have a situation later on that we will talk about. So this is what it looks like. This is where people live in these sprawling settlements, taking up a lot of green land and having to commute every day from these homes to Port of Spain. Next slide. So let's go and talk about mitigation. I think we will have had an understanding of what the problem is by those few slides. So what do we do about mitigation? First of all, let us define mitigation. Mitigation, according to the United Nations Framework Convention, is a human intervention to reduce the sources or enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases. So it's on 2 fronts: reducing the sources, which we do which we try to do by the measures that Joseph spoke about, or to enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases. And we talk about using fossil fuels more efficiently for industrial processes of electricity generation, switching to solar energy or wind power, improving the insulation of buildings, and with respect to the sinks, expanding forests and other sinks to remove greater amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Next slide. So this is a little image of Port of Spain. We don't have time to go into detail as to what is where, but what can we as planners do? We can formulate and I underscore enforce, because one of our biggest weaknesses as planners is having our plans enforced. So we formulate and enforce plans and policies that serve to reduce urban sprawl and to create compact, higher density communities and mixed-use developments which minimize the journey from home to work. And this goes hand in hand with also the concept of decentralization. Okay, so in order to fill the demand for land for housing, we need to restrict new growth as infill in vacant pockets in already developed areas. And there are quite a few areas within Port of Spain that can be used to fill the demand for part of the demand for housing. We talk about, our planners talk a lot about the power gen site, which was up until recently power generation. So we think that after adequate remediation, that site is ideal for housing development. And there's another site and several sites within Port of Spain that can be used for housing, as opposed to greenfield sites, as opposed to extending urban areas outside of built-up areas. Next slide. Okay, so we can talk about smart growth just for a second. Joseph talked about smart cities and those concepts. And there's the concept of smart growth, in which new development is concentrated in compact, walkable urban centers to avoid sprawl. So this is where we'd like to see our urban centers grow, and there's no reason Port of Spain can't be further developed in that way. Involves transit-oriented, walkable, bicycle-friendly land use, including neighborhood schools and mixed-use development with a range of housing choices. So Joseph talked about green cities. So we won't go into that. Next slide. What is critical? We talked about. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, we talked about sinks that absorb carbon dioxide. And the 2 main ones are forests and mangroves. So this is forests are one of the most important elements in the mitigation toolkit of stock of forests because the vegetation performs a critical function of absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere, along with wetlands, the mangrove swamps. So we need, in terms of, we have some planning exercises hopefully coming up soon. And our new legislation that mandates planning at all levels. So planners would like to see these plans specifically draw very firm boundaries around forested land and to have the National Physical Planning Authority and the municipal corporations working together with the relevant agencies to enforce policy coming out of those plans and prevent encroachment of those boundaries and incursions into forested areas, because it is not only planners involved. And in fact, in a lot of what I'm talking about, planners might not have a direct role. So it is up to us to educate the other agencies, educate certainly the policymakers, as well as the public. So we're looking at, we're hoping that these agencies coordinate with the forestry division to treat with the problems of residential and agricultural squatting, overharvesting, fires, and other forms of damage. Next slide. Okay. And so let's go to adaptation. And I want to quote from the Honorable Mia Motley, Prime Minister of Barbados, as she spoke at the 9th Summit of the Americas last week, I think, or week before. She says, we need to be able to prepare before the crisis so that we can reduce what we have to spend. We need to recognize that adaptation has no private sector follow-up because there's no return on investment in adapting to the climate realities. That is the function of the state. Next slide. Okay, so what do we have to adapt to? We have to adapt to the certainty of rainfall-induced flooding. There's also coastal flooding, which we talk about later on, but let's look at rainfall-induced flooding because we expect to have an increase in the intensity of rainfall combined, and that combined with deforestation will cause increased flooding in floodplains. And we had a catastrophic flooding in 2019, 3 years ago, in a development called Greenvale Park in La Joqueta, which is in the east, which was developed in the floodplain of the Caroni River, which is the largest river in Trinidad and Tobago, and almost annually in St. Helena and South Oropouche. And we fear that this becomes the rainy season norm unless appropriate land use planning policy and standards are formulated and enforced to address the issue. Next slide. And that next slide shows La Joqueta, Greenvale. The red line is the southerly limit of the original La Joqueta development. La Joqueta is a state housing settlement. And so the first phase was, which was intended to be the entire development, was maybe not sufficiently set back from the river, but in any case was a reasonable distance. That's a red line. And then there was a smart idea to develop more housing in that area. Sometimes it looks as if the methodology for selecting sites for housing is just to look at it from above and see where there's some vacant land. So anyway, so this is La Joqueta, this is Greenvale. This is the blue line is the Caroni River, which is the largest river in Trinidad. So guess what happened? Next slide. The slides are, I think I'm missing a slide. So we had some really bad flooding a few years ago in Greenvale. So how do we deal with this? Apart from the problem of developing land in floodplains, we do have to get to the source of the problem, where it starts. It starts in the upper watersheds. And therefore, from the point of view of adapting to flooding, it is the the planning unit needs to be the watershed as opposed to the political units, the municipalities on which we base our regional plans. And it is the manner in which land is developed in the upper watersheds that has created a lot of these problems with flooding downstream. We look at the way that, next slide, the way that land is developed in the hillside. People seem to buy land for the view and then proceed to excavate as much of the land as possible to put a flat building on. So this is what we end up with. Next slide. So this is a short list out of a long list of adaptive site development standards that are intended to basically to limit the coverage of the land by build development, where it is determined that hillside development has to take place. So we're looking at issues like the design of mandating the design of layouts, such as lotification and street arrangements conform to the contours of the site. The idea is to minimize the disturbance of the land and the need for removal of trees and other vegetative cover, which serves two purposes. That serves the purpose of minimizing runoff and sedimentation of our watercourses and contributing to flooding downstream, as well as, like I said before, keeping forest cover to act as sinks for carbon dioxide. You can talk about terrain adaptive architecture, so you fit your building to the terrain as opposed to the other way around. Developing in clusters. I will not go through this list because I think that my time is probably almost up. And this next slide, please. The next slide gives an example of what we talk about terrain adaptive layout. What we do not do is I don't know if anybody does this, the arrangement on the right, on a sloping site. So, but anyway, that's not what you do. You do a layout that is faithful to the contours of the land. Next slide. And this is in elevation, what is terrain adaptive architecture. Again, instead of hauling out the land, you build according to the contours of the land. And you fit the house to the land as opposed to the other way around. And this is all with a view to minimizing the amount of engineering operations and the disturbance of vegetation and soil and so on that contribute to flooding. We talk also about adapting to landslides and landslips. And in terms of planning, our methodology must involve the identification of land that is vulnerable to slippage and its inclusion from development. There was a time when the policy that the Town and Country Planning Division enforced had to do with just the height above mean sea level. It was a 300-foot, 90-meter height above sea level that was the limit to the development. So now I think the idea is to look more at the characteristics of a site as opposed to just the height. So we need to be cognizant of where these lands are that are vulnerable to slippage and to exclude those from consideration for development. Next slide. So we need to look to see how we adapt to coastal flooding and coastal erosion. This is another big one. And I'm quoting from another of our Caribbean leaders, this time the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, the Honorable Pete Rowley, who was speaking at COP26, the Conference of Parties last year in Scotland, who quotes a quote from him: we're suffering aggressive erosion of our coastlines, all of us. Adaptation to coastal flooding and coastal erosion from the perspective of the spatial planner requires attention to the siting of development in relation to the coast. To put in development as distant from the high water mark as necessary to ensure the safety of the lives and property of coastal communities. Looking at the Barbados integrated coastal zone management plan, that stipulates building setbacks on the coastline of not less, that is the barest minimum, not less than 30 meters. And the required setback is much greater in some areas, for example, along the east coast of the island, and wherever 200-meter landscape buffer is deemed to be required. And again, this is the aim of pushing development away from any potential damage from wave attack and storm surge. Special considerations are made for eroding beaches and those beaches where turtle nesting sites are located. Next slide. This is another big one, protecting mangrove forests, because we have to be cognizant of the role of mangroves in providing coastal protection from storm surge and the consequent flooding and erosion that take place when we destroy our mangroves. So land use plans and policies for areas where they exist naturally must explicitly seek to protect them from encroachment and alteration, either directly or indirectly, from runoff that would render them more susceptible to climate change impacts. We have a example of a degradation of one of our swamps on the east coast of Trinidad in the river swamp, which was used really for most of its existence, a lot of its existence, for rice and cannabis cultivation. And it was recently afforded protection under the Ramsar Convention and has been rehabilitated as a very important sink, carbon dioxide sink. And so I think my time is probably up, so go to the next slide. I welcome questions. My time is up, and so is Bird's time, which is what this is a placard that was displayed at that COP26 last year. Time is up. Time is indeed up, and it's time that we do something, whatever we can, about dealing with this issue of climate change from the point of view of urban and regional planning and from whatever other means. So thank you very much for listening, and I thank the organizers again for allowing us this opportunity to contribute to this very important forum. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I have one question from the chat, which again is from Doreen Duncan, and is about something you talked about earlier in the presentation, which is about the importance of increasing density, but also of making towns walkable and truly walkable, and trying to persuade people out of their cars. And she wants you to tell us about how Trinidad and Tobago invests or prioritize infrastructure for walking, if you have any information about that.
Okay, easy answer is no, we do not prioritize infrastructure for walking. There are a lot of areas. I walk in Port of Spain a lot, and I think it's one of the most difficult cities for walking in terms of safety from motor vehicles and so on, but also because of the quality of our sidewalks. So the answer is no, we do not prioritize walkability. Right. And that is that's a big one that would need to be addressed.
Yes, I would certainly concur with that, and I think Bridgetown is no better. I think the walkability of our cities is very poorly conceived. I just wondered if anybody else in the audience had a question. I've got two in the audience.
Good afternoon to everyone. Dr. Nicole Greenwich from SEDEMA, Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. I just want to thank you, Grace, for your presentation. I couldn't sit back and not say anything as we're speaking on the topic of mitigation of climate change and urban and regional planning. My question is twofold. I heard you speak about, I know the focus of your presentation is climate change. at the region, we're promoting safer and resilient states through comprehensive disaster management. So as we speak to climate change, I want to know, what do you see as the nexus between climate change and disaster risk management as you approach this topic of urban and regional planning? Now, with climate change, we're looking at climate-related hazards. So I appreciated the examples that you brought about flooding, but we do have other hazards that we need to bear in mind. And I think that the resources that we have are so limited that we have to take a comprehensive approach to how we undertake planning in the region. So I want to hear from you in terms of the nexus that you see between dealing with climate change in planning and disaster risk management. And then the second question that I have relates to the fact that a lot of the adaptive actions that have been placed on the table, I'm sure a lot of us have been hearing this for some time, where we have to look at the system. We have to look at what's happening in the upper part of the watershed. We have to look at we have to look at system-based kind of solutions as well. It doesn't always have to be hard solutions. There are soft solutions as well. So I know you said, besides looking at the fact that we're developing in floodplains, what is the issue? What is necessary for us to see the results, whereby, we take this knowledge now and put it into action, whereby we can have more resilient planning outcomes? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. The whole issue of disaster risk management is critical. I was talking specifically about flooding and coastal erosion, but there are a whole host of other disasters that need to be addressed in a comprehensive way with respect to disaster risk management. But one of the things we have to understand about disaster is the definition of a disaster. We have natural hazards, which you might say flooding might be a natural hazard because the rain falls, the rivers flood, and the floodplain is the hydrological unit that accommodates the floodwaters, supposed to accommodate the floodwaters, and that's fine if nobody lives there. It's when you it's the intersection between people and the hazards that turn to disaster. So to me, it is really basically all about land use planning and where we put people to live. If there was nobody living in Greenville, it would not have been an issue. It might not have made the news, but it's because of the fact that we created this intersection between housing and this natural hazard, that it has created a problem. So it is really, like I said, basically where we put people to live, and it is our duty as planners to try to understand that. Something you touched on that I'm thinking, one of our failures, I've always said our failures as environmentalists has been not sufficiently to educate the public. We have to be looking at educating the public and certainly the policymakers, because one of the problems with, and something that I had in one of my slides that I had to take out in the interest of time, was an article that appeared in one of the newspapers when this flooding happened, that indicated that Greenville was refused planning permission twice. And that talks to the fact that we need to educate our policymakers. The planners know and they have the answers, and they try to do the policies and so on. But if we do not educate the policymakers, or if they do not see the need that we are pointing to, we have a problem. So public education, educating the policymakers. Again, one of the problems that we have, one of the issues that I intended to touch on was the role of policymakers. The problem with the transportation, that slide that I showed with the traffic coming into Port of Spain, the answer always from the policymakers is to just build more, let's just build more highways, more overpasses and roads. And that is the solution usually. And so in the process of doing that, we make the situation worse because the construction stage of anything, of whether it's highways, roads, buildings, is one of the biggest impacts on the problem. And so it is, we need to be really educating our policymakers and especially the politicians, because usually good intention, we will need housing. And so let's just find a piece of land where it's cheaper because it's flat to put housing. And at the end, again, I have information on the cost of cleaning up Greenvale. It was several millions of dollars. With respect to the next question, the issue of system-based.
Yes, can we just take the next question?
Oh, well, there were two questions that were asked. I don't know if she.
Right.
It was two parts.
Right. So part of the solution again is public education and educating the policymakers to the impacts of their actions. Okay, I think that answers that second question as well.
So, Carol Archer from the University of Technology, Jamaica. Grace, I just want to pick up on what you just said in terms of public education, because one of the things I was hoping for, I've been hoping to be able to identify as practitioner and as academic, a toolkit that planners can use to educate the public and policymakers to say, here's a matrix. If you were to go ahead with this development, this is the impact. This is how we can mitigate, so that persons will have full information and not see a hotel being developed and we're told that, look, this is necessary to build this hotel because of the economic benefit. Meanwhile, it is destroying the ecological system in its surroundings. I think part of what we need to do as planners, and I'm asking you to speak to this, is how can we, as part of expanding the public education, put in place, and what would we put in that toolkit so that the information can be provided in a way that is simple and accessible to all to see the impact and how we can mitigate when we're making planning and land use decision in that is necessary. I think we need to not just say to do it, but really speak to how. And I think this forum is an ideal place for us to begin to identify a toolkit that we can use throughout the Caribbean to address the situation that we are faced with.
Okay, Carol, you're right. It is we do need to develop some kind of toolkit. I am not very optimistic, given that politicians have a 5-year time frame. We talk about the NIMBY syndrome, not in my backyard. There's also a NIM2 syndrome, not in my term of office. And sometimes politicians understand very clearly what the impacts of their decisions are. But it is about the next 5 years and being reelected. And I don't know how we get around that, but I think we do have to make more strenuous efforts to educate the public. We have to educate a public that is tied to the car. You can't go a mile without getting into a car, because the car is still, I think, a status symbol for a lot of people. So we need to have, I would love to find out myself, how do we develop some education program to get the knowledge. And I think people will act if they understand what the implications are, if they understand. World Health Organization is now saying that the Caribbean is going to become unlivable in a very short time because of the heat. I think if we get that information to people, and if we get the information, if we make the link between the Greenville flooding, for instance, and what we are doing every time we get into our cars, I think that could go a little way, but it is a major task, and I really do not know what the answers are. But it has to be done if we are to make any headway at all in addressing the issue of our greenhouse gas emissions coming out of the transportation sector, certainly. So that is something that I would love to hear if there are any other suggestions as to how we do that, how we get this point across to people. That our children and grandchildren are not going to be able to live properly if we don't do something. Well, and of course, this is what is
Okay, I think sorry to interrupt, Grace, but we're running at very short of time, and we have got one more question in the audience. So I'd like to give him an opportunity to ask a question, and if you could respond relatively briefly, because I think we've got another session in this room and we'll have to leave shortly, but it's been really stimulating discussion. So if I can pass over.
So as Grace said, our time is out. I just want to make two quick things in that, in terms, Grace, in respect of the hillside development policies, Jamaica has actually gone through an exercise several years ago, and we do have a hillside development manual. But it is something that I think you should look on, and also look on our experiences as well. And that was done between NEPA, other agencies, and Mines and Geology. And we can discuss the experiences. The other thing has to do with the identification process. We are also going through that process. And it is something I think we need to discuss as well. Because when we sat down, well, I was one of the architects of it. Dr. Harcho was one along with other groups. But theoretically, when we talk about densification, implementing it is normally another issue. Because even though we do not like sprawl, a lot of persons do not like densification, because it leads to a lot of issues in terms of not only heat islands, and the COVID taught us something as well about densification. But there's another issue in that even when we're talking about NIMBY, there are not calling it cave, but there are citizens who are against virtually everything. There are some people that you might call bananas, build absolutely nothing near anywhere that I'm near.
Right.
But the fact though is that when we start to change neighborhoods as well, there are persons that are there for years that are impacted negatively, and that is not taken account. Yes, we look nice and it's gonna work. Every day I get an email from the president of Eastwood Parks Association to my email. Sometimes it gets a bit rude. That's listen, you are destroying our neighborhood. Yet still, this area is right in the middle of Alpha 3, which is the capital for St. Andrew, right? So something we have to think about carefully, or we're gonna address it. I don't know, because your slide did talk about densification. Densification is not only about apartments, it can be smaller lot sizes as well. But there seems to be an issue in that Jamaicans, I don't know about anybody else, they do not like small lots. They like the idea of having a mango tree, having a coconut tree, and no problem with mango trees. They grow and they're gonna knock down so your neighbor's house, your house, and everybody else when the roots get big, breadfruit trees. So I think we have a situation that this is something we need to sit down and discuss. And why I'm saying all of this is this, that I think, as Carol said, and I'm going a little deeper, we need to probably start to share notes across the region even more. The CUF is good, but even after the CUF, we need to have emails and everything else that we can start to share notes, because we are replicating some of what we are doing, and there are lessons to be learned from each other as well. So CUF is great, but we need to do a little extra work on it.
Thank you very much. We really have very little time left. So if you could just make a brief comment on that contribution, and then I'm afraid we will have to wind up the session. It would be very nice to be able to go on for longer, but can I ask you just to make a final comment?
Right, just quickly, it would be just perfect if we can collaborate. I would love to keep in touch with you because again, we kind of reinventing the wheel every time we need to look at policy, whereas Trinidad and Tobago might very well benefit from what you are doing in the Blue Mountains. So I would like to keep in touch and just to say just a word about the issue of densification. To me, there was up until not too long ago, people would not think about going to a higher density development, especially the public housing. They call plannings here in Trinidad and Tobago. People call them plannings disparagingly. And I think, ironically, what kind of helps with attracting people to the higher density situation is a crime situation. The reality is that you are safer in maybe a gated community but sitting near higher density than if you're living on a 5,000 square foot plot and you have to stop to open your gate to let you to drive in, which is where we're having a lot of problems with crime. So yes, we do need to share information, and we would need to think of some way to form. Now we have WhatsApp and it's very easy to communicate. And I think that we need to develop that idea to keep in touch and to share information what each other is doing. So thank you very much.
And thank you very much as well, Grace. I think the last point that everybody's made is the purpose of this conference, which is about sharing experiences. And I think the more that dialogue can continue, the more benefit it will be to all of us sitting in this room, and more importantly, to the communities that we work for and with. So on that note, can I just thank both of our excellent speakers, and on behalf of the Caribbean Urban Forum, say, I'd now like to bring this session to a close, but thank you very much, all the audience participation and the excellent presentations. Thank you.